What would you do if, in the dead of winter, you stepped outside and found a body collapsed at your fence line? A stranger, not knowing whether she was a blessing or a curse leave her, and you carry the guilt forever. Take her in, and you might be opening the door to danger itself. That was the choice Elias Boone faced. Before we dive deeper into this story, let me pause just a moment. If you're listening now, especially those of you who've lived long enough to know how life can turn in a heartbeat, please hit that like button to show your support. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from, maybe from the comfort of a warm home, maybe from a porch out in the country. I promise you, what follows will be worth your time. Because this isn't just a Western tale. It's about the line we all walk between fear and compassion, between protecting ourselves and opening the door to destiny. That night on the rim of Juniper Basin, the wind screamed through the hills, driving snow dust against the rough logs of a lone cabin. Inside, a weak lantern flickered across the small room, where Elias Boone, 34, sat sharpening a blade. His frame was lean but strong from years of setting posts and hauling hay. A scar along his forearm, earned in the war, marked him more deeply than he cared to admit. His wife had died of fever, his child before its first birthday. That was why he had come west, why he built this place as a fortress of solitude, a life where no one asked about the graves he'd left behind. Silence had become his survival, until a sound broke it. At first, Elias thought it was nothing more than the wind rattling the fence. But something in his chest warned otherwise. He grabbed his coat, lit the lantern higher, and stepped onto the porch. The yellow glow swept across frozen earth, past the fence posts, and landed on a crumpled figure in the snow. In that instant, war memories slammed back into him, bodies lying across the field, ambushes hidden beneath the quiet. His grip on the lantern tightened. Was this a trick, a trap out here? Apache meant trouble, or so the townsfolk said, and the figure before him bore all the marks: long braid, dark skin, a deerskin dress torn and stiff with frost. The name Apache itself carried whispers of raids and blood. Elias stood frozen, torn between the instinct to guard his door and the pull of something deeper, because when the lantern caught her face, lips cracked, breath barely there, rope burns around her wrists, he knew he couldn't just turn away. He lowered himself, touched her shoulder. Her skin was ice. She's still breathing, he muttered. The decision was made before he even knew it. Elias slid his arms under her slight frame, lighter than a sack of grain, and carried her inside. The door slammed shut on the wind, but inside his chest a storm raged louder than anything outside. He laid her on his bed, covered her with his coat, then dropped heavily into the chair. The fire snapped in the stove, throwing light across her bruised face. He didn't know her name yet. Ahyoka Graybird, but he knew enough. Enough to understand she had been left for dead. Enough to understand someone, somewhere, might come looking. And that was the heart of his fear. If enemies had abandoned her, they might soon return. If the town knew, trouble would follow him home. But if he left her in the snow, the silence inside him would never forgive it. So he sat there through the night, eyes locked on the stranger fighting for breath. At times he thought he heard phantom footsteps, imagined fists pounding on the door. At times he wondered if he had just pulled ruin into his life. But whenever he looked at her chest, rise and fall, faint though it was, he knew the choice had already been sealed. By the time dawn slid pale light through the small window, Juniper Basin was still frozen, but something inside that cabin had shifted. Elias Boone, the man who came west to be left alone, now found himself bound to a stranger, and whether it brought redemption or ruin, his life would never again be the same. Morning crept slow across Juniper Basin, pale light spilling through the small cabin window and brushing the air with a faint promise of warmth. Elias Boone had sat all night in the chair, his back stiff, his eyes fixed on the stranger he'd pulled from the snow. Her breathing had steadied, her cheeks touched with color where before there had been only gray. He didn't know what he was waiting for, a word of thanks, a flood of trouble, or simply proof that bringing her inside hadn't been a deadly mistake. Her eyelids fluttered. She shifted under his coat, then opened her eyes, dark and watchful, like a wild bird not sure if it was free or still trapped. Elias reached for the cup he'd filled earlier, setting it beside her with a steady hand. "You need this," he said quietly. Her trembling fingers closed around the tin cup. She drank slowly, each swallow as careful as if the water might be taken away again. When the cup was empty, she held it between her palms. For a long moment she only stared at him. Then, her voice came low, rough with weakness but clear. "You saved me. According to the sacred law of my people, I must bear you children." The word struck the room like a hammer blow. Elias stiffened, breath caught in his chest. He had braced for fear, for a plea for food or shelter, but not this. Her declaration carried the weight of ritual, of duty, of something he'd never asked for. His mind scrambled. He'd heard campfire tales in the army, whispered talk of tribal customs, laws strangers could never understand. But he hadn't expected one to land in his cabin, spoken so plainly by a woman half-frozen only hours before. He shook his head, voice firm though not unkind. "No, not here. No law binds you to me. You don't owe me anything." Her eyes narrowed not in anger, but in confusion, as though she couldn't make sense of his refusal. She whispered again, clinging to the cup in her hands. "My people say, if a man saves a woman's life, she gives him life in return. That way. No one is left alone." The cabin seemed to shrink, the silence pressing in around them. Elias turned his gaze to the scar on his forearm, a mark from the war that had taken so much. His voice came slow, edged with the weight of memory. "You've had enough taken from you," he said. "This place, it asks nothing. Rest here. Eat here. No bargain. No debt." She watched him then, her eyes darting across the cabin, the rifle by the door, the rough-hewn table, the single chair he'd sat in all night, as if measuring whether this man could be trusted, or whether he was simply hiding his demand behind patience. Elias felt her scrutiny, and something in him shifted. He'd built this cabin to keep silence, not to explain himself. But silence wasn't enough now. "I had a family once," he admitted, voice low. "The war took plenty, and fever took the rest. I came out here so no one would ask questions, just to keep breathing." Her lips trembled before she found her words. "I was cast out. No food, no family left. I walked until I could not." He didn't press her further. He knew enough already enough to understand exile, hunger, and the kind of pain that made a person choose death over another step. From the stove came the bubbling of beans, filling the cabin with a simple, homely smell. Elias slid bread and beans toward her. "Eat. That's all that's asked." Her hands shook as she reached for the food, not only from weakness, but from the strangeness of this moment. She glanced up at him, searching, almost testing. Would he change his mind? Would he demand what she had offered under law? But he didn't. He only sat, quiet, watchful, his palms resting open on his knees so she could see he meant no threat. Outside, the morning wind swept across the ridges of Juniper Basin, carrying a low, mournful whistle. Inside, two broken lives sat across from each other, no longer strangers bound by tribal law, but by the uneasy, fragile tension of surprise and uncertainty. And in that fragile space, something small began to root itself. Not love, Not vows, just the simple truth that Elias Boone had chosen to let the Apache woman stay, without demanding a thing in return. In those first days inside the cabin, silence hung like an invisible wall. Elias Boone was used to it. Ahyoka Graybird was not. She moved carefully, her eyes studying every corner, every gesture of the man who had carried her out of the snow. In her gaze lay fear, the fear of being cast out, of being treated as a burden, of the helping hand turning into a shackle. For Elias, it was a different unease, the strangeness of a woman's presence in a room that had, for years, belonged only to solitude and old grief. On the third morning, Ahyoka stood for the first time on her own, walking slowly around the cabin. Her steps were unsteady, her legs weak, yet her hands were determined. She gathered small sticks and fed them into the stove. Elias started to rise and stop her, but then caught the silent plea in her eyes, "Let me do this. Don't let me be useless." He only gave a small nod, watching as she bent to her work. That afternoon, she found a half-empty sack of flour tucked in the corner. With clumsy but patient hands, she shaped the rough dough into flat pieces and set them to bake over the iron stove. The smell was simple, earthy, and it filled the cabin with a warmth Elias hadn't known in years. It reminded him of the days when family sat at his table, memories that cut and comforted in the same breath. When Ahyoka placed a small piece of bread before him, her hands trembling slightly, Elias didn't speak. He only gave her a quiet nod, meeting her eyes in acknowledgement. "You're not just a guest, you're part of this place now." In the late afternoons, when pale light drifted through the cracks in the cabin walls, Ahyoka sat sewing at her torn deerskin dress. She used thread from Elias's old box, her stitches slow but steady. More than once. Elias paused from mending horsetack just to watch. He realized she wasn't simply sewing cloth. She was stitching back her dignity, proving that though she had been cast out, she still held worth. Elias understood. In her fight to reclaim some usefulness, he saw his own reflection how, after the war, he had forced himself into endless work to keep from drowning in despair. Each fence post, each feed sack, had been a way to remind himself he still mattered. That silent kinship tied him to her more tightly than words ever could. One evening, as the wind rattled the shutters and howled through the basin, Ahyoka flinched at the sound. Her hands clutched the coat tighter, her eyes darting as though waiting for punishment to come through the door. Elias set down the ledger he'd been scribbling in, slid his chair closer to the stove, and spoke softly. "No one's coming for you here. It's just the wind. It can't hurt you." The words were plain, but his tone carried a weight that soothed her shoulders. For the first time, she eased back into her chair without bracing herself, letting the fire's warmth settle over her. The next day, she offered him a necklace, only a string with a few beads left, salvaged from her ruined dress. "I keep it. To remember," she said haltingly. Elias took it, feeling the gravity of the gift. The beads were not much, but the trust she placed in his hands was heavier than stone, in those small acts. Elias felt the cabin itself changing. Once it had been a fortress of silence for one man. Now it was becoming a shelter for two wounded souls. Not yet love, not yet commitment, but something fragile, trust, thin as a thread, yet worth protecting. At 34, Elias knew too well how silence could hollow a man out. But as Ahyoka filled the cabin with the smell of bread, the faint sound of needle and thread, or the shy glance seeking his acknowledgement, he began to hear something else in the quiet and echo. And in those first hesitant days, a thread was drawn between them, not by sacred law, not by spoken vow, but by small, ordinary choices. Step by step, they were stitching something back together. A fragile trust just enough to carry both Elias Boone and Ahyoka Graybird forward into whatever would come next. That morning, the pale sun crept over the rim of Juniper Basin, laying faint streaks of light across frozen ground. Elias Boone pushed open the cabin door, his boots grinding on hard earth. Behind him, Ahyoka Graybird stepped out, wrapped in his old coat, her long braids stirring in the cold wind. Elias led her to the woodpile stacked under a canvas. He swung the axe down, the crack of splitting timber sharp in the still air. Then he handed her the smaller hatchet. "Try it," he said, his voice low but gentle. Ahyoka gripped the handle, awkward but determined. Each clumsy strike made Elias wince with worry, yet it warmed him too. He stepped closer, adjusted her stance with a hand on her shoulder, not only to guide, but to reassure her she didn't have to carry this work alone. By midday, he took her to the corral. The bay gelding, Thunder, lifted his head, breath steaming in the chill. Ahyoka hesitated. Elias reached for her hand and laid it against the horse's neck. "He won't hurt you," he said softly. At first her fingers trembled, but when Thunder lowered his head and nudged her palm, the faintest smile touched her lips. For Elias, it was the first time he had seen her face light since bringing her in from the snow. Caring for the horse gave her something she hadn't had in days, a sense of being needed. Later they walked the narrow path to Cottonwood Creek. The water ran clear, but the stones along the bank were slick with ice. Ahyoka bent to fill the dipper, slipped, and Elias caught her arm just in time. She looked up, her eyes wide with surprise. Her cheeks flushed not only from cold, but from the nearness of his hand. He gave a small nod and let go carefully, enough for her to find her balance again. He understood for someone once bound and abandoned. Being steadied was more than rescue. It was proof she no longer stood alone. When supplies grew thin, Elias knew he couldn't put off a trip to town. Ahyoka insisted on going with him. He hesitated, knowing what stares and whispers would come in Sagebrush Crossing. But her voice carried quiet pride. She didn't want to be hidden. Not again. At last, Elias said, "All right, but stay close to me." They rode Thunder down the valley. Ahyoka sat straight in the saddle, her hands tight, her expression proud, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. Elias walked at her side, steady, scanning the road as if daring anyone to step toward her. The bell over the store door jingled as they entered. Every head turned. Eyes lingered on Ahyoka, and low mutters rippled from the back of the room. Elias felt the shift in the air. His hand rested lightly on the butt of his pistol, not to threaten, but as a warning. He set coins on the counter. Flour. Coffee. Sugar. That spool of thread. The shopkeeper hesitated, then obeyed, when Ahyoka's eyes flicked toward a tin of salve and a strip of soft leather. Elias added them too. "For the tack," he said aloud. But both of them knew one was meant for her cracked hands, the other for her braid. Outside, Ahyoka exhaled the breath she'd been holding. "They don't want me here," she murmured. Elias fastened the supplies to Thunder's saddle. "They don't have to want you. They just have to leave you be. And I won't let anyone lay a hand on you." The wind swept hard across the plain on their way back, but Ahyoka's eyes carried something new. The fear was still there, but now it was joined by trust, a fragile certainty that she wasn't facing the world alone. And for Elias, each step of his boots on the frozen earth felt lighter, because he knew his decision to shield this Apache woman wasn't duty forced on him. It was a choice he had made. Back in the cabin at Juniper Basin, the rhythm of work splitting wood, tending Thunder, fetching water, buying supplies had become something else, more than survival. It was the weaving of a bond. Through these simple tasks, Elias Boone and Ahyoka Graybird were beginning to claim what both thought they had lost forever, a place to belong, and someone to believe in. Nights in Juniper Basin were long and cold, But inside the cabin, something had begun to change. It was no longer just the wind whistling through the cracks or the pop of firewood in the stove. Now the place carried small, human sounds, the clink of a spoon against a tin bowl, the steady pull of a needle through cloth, the quiet rhythm of two people breathing in the same space. Elias Boone noticed the change first in Ahyoka Graybird's eyes. In the beginning, they had been sharp, guarded, always watching him as if waiting for a demand she couldn't refuse. But meal by meal, with each piece of bread she laid before him, that look softened. When they sat across from each other in the lamplight, shadows flickering on the log walls, the silence no longer felt like distance. It felt like closeness. One night, after a pot of beans, Ahyoka set his bowl on the table. Her fingers brushed his hand, and both of them froze for a heartbeat. Neither pulled away. Their eyes met, and in that quiet glance was the truth they were sharing more than food. The next day, Elias worked leather at the bench while Ahyoka stitched at her torn dress. When the thread slipped free of the needle, she gave a small laugh, hesitant but real. The sound startled Elias. He couldn't remember the last time laughter had filled this cabin. Once. It had been a place of ghosts. Now, that thin laugh drove them out, if only for a moment. Closeness grew out of ordinary things. Each morning, Elias still rose early to light the stove. But now, Ahyoka stood beside him. She stacked kindling. He shoveled coals, their shoulders brushing as they moved around the cramped hearth. When the smell of coffee filled the room, she set his cup in front of him, her hand grazing his. Elias felt something stir where he thought nothing lived anymore. His heart, buried with a wife and child, found itself moved again by small gestures, a shy smile, a shared laugh. The simple act of sitting together at a table. Ahyoka changed too. No longer did she crouch in the corner like a cast-off. She took her place in the cabin, folding blankets after sleep, seasoning beans with a pinch of salt, tidying dishes while Elias worked. Each act said plainly, "I belong here." Elias never spoke it aloud, but the quiet approval in his eyes told her he agreed. One evening, Elias led Thunder back to the corral after checking the fence line. When he returned, the cabin smelled of baking bread. Ahyoka glanced up from the stove and asked softly, "Are you tired?" The words caught him off guard. How long had it been since anyone asked him that her voice wasn't loud? But it was real enough to tighten his chest. He only answered, "I'm fine." But his eyes lingered on her longer than usual, saying what his words would not. That night they lingered by the fire. Elias bent over his work, repairing a strap, while Ahyoka loosened her braid and combed her long hair. The lamplight caught her face. Elias glanced once, then quickly looked back to his hands, afraid she might think him a man with selfish intent. But Ahyoka didn't turn away. She let the moment hang, no longer a woman bound by debt, but one learning how to accept a man's gaze. Their intimacy was unspoken, carried in the smallest things, a bowl set within reach, a smile when eyes met, a hand that touched and didn't retreat. Inside the small cabin in Juniper Basin, two people once discarded by fate were learning to let each other's warmth fill the empty spaces. The bond was fragile, but real like a spark glowing in the long night, not strong enough yet to light the whole path ahead, but strong enough for Elias Boone and Ahyoka Graybird to believe they no longer faced the world alone. Inside the small cabin at the edge of Juniper Basin, the lantern flickered low, throwing a warm glow across the rough-hewn walls. That night felt different from the others. It wasn't just the smell of beans simmering or the wind clawing at the door. Between Elias Boone and Ahyoka Graybird, the air had thickened with things unspoken, feelings that had grown quietly, waiting for a voice. Elias sat at the table, his sleeves rolled up, the scar on his forearm plain in the lamplight. He rarely spoke of it. But when he noticed Ahyoka's eyes resting there, he let out a long breath and said, almost reluctantly, "This one. Cavalry fight. The man beside me didn't make it. I've carried it ever since." He kept his gaze on the table, unwilling to see pity. But instead of turning away, Ahyoka reached out, her slender fingers brushing the raised flesh. Elias startled, not from pain, but from the unexpected gentleness of her touch. Her voice came quiet. "Steady. I carry marks, too." She turned her wrist to show faint scars from rope burns. "I was led like an animal. I thought I would die tied that way. But I am still here." 2 hands, one bearing the scar of war, the other the scars of bondage, hovered close together. Elias lifted his eyes and met hers. For a moment they both hesitated, not from unwillingness, but from fear of breaking what they had just begun to build. The silence stretched taut as a thread. Elias drew a breath, ready to retreat into the distance he knew so well. But Ahyoka, with a quiet courage, lifted her chin and closed the gap. Their lips met hesitant at first, then firmer as Elias answered, his hand resting gently on her shoulder while hers pressed against his chest. It was not a rushed kiss, nor a burning one. It was shy, uncertain, carrying all the awkwardness of 2 souls long unused to tenderness. When they pulled apart, both sat still, breathing uneven, eyes darting away like the bashful glance of the young. Ahyoka lifted her hand to her lips, as if uncertain of what had just happened, frightened, embarrassed, yet unwilling to regret it. Elias lowered his head, his voice rough. "You don't owe me anything. Not even this. That kiss, it wasn't law. It wasn't debt." She nodded softly. The blush on her cheeks betrayed her shyness, but there was safety there too. For the first time, she knew she was not bound by the sacred law she had spoken of. She was bound by her own choice. That night, Elias gave her the bed as always, and sat in his chair. But before she turned away, Ahyoka reached out her hand. Elias hesitated, then took it. They sat in the fading glow of the lantern, their fingers intertwined. No words passed between them, only warmth and awkward, tender truth they had chosen to step closer. And in that little cabin on the edge of the desert, 2 people who thought they had lost everything discovered something new. Not obligation, not law, but the shy, uncertain beginning of hearts learning once more how to open. Spring pushed into Juniper Basin, snow melting into dark soil, streams running full again. Inside the cabin, the steady rhythm of hammer and nail echoed like the heartbeat of something new. Elias Boone stood at the rough-hewn table, hands firm on the mallet, eyes focused on a board of juniper wood. The scent of sap filled the air, mingling with the warmth from the stove. He wasn't building fence or mending tack this time. He was shaping a cradle. By the window. Ahyoka Graybird worked needle and thread, piecing scraps of cloth into a small blanket. Each time Elias drove a nail. She looked up, her eyes carrying both shyness and quiet warmth. When he paused to wipe the sweat from his brow, she asked softly, "Who is it for?" Elias gave a rare smile, plain and true. "For us, for the future." Her hand stilled. She set the needle aside, crossed to him, and placed his calloused hand gently on her belly. Her voice came in a whisper, trembling but sure. "The future isn't just ahead. It's already here." Elias froze. Then his eyes softened. His breath caught as he pressed his hand more firmly, as though trying to feel what could not yet be seen. For a heartbeat, the grief of the child he had lost long ago returned. But instead of dragging him down, it lifted him with the startling truth life was being given back to him. He bent his forehead to hers, voice husky but tender. "You will never be cast out again. Not by law, not by hunger, Not by any man. You are my wife. And this child is ours." Weeks later, as wildflowers spread across the slopes, Elias led Thunder down to the valley with Ahyoka riding steady behind him. They came to the small chapel at the edge of Sagebrush Crossing, where Reverend Josiah Pike, silver-haired and gentle, welcomed them. Inside the simple wooden building, light streamed through colored panes, falling across the benches. There, Elias and Ahyoka stood side by side. Elias wore his oldest shirt, scrubbed clean and pressed. Ahyoka wore her mended dress, plain but neat, with a ribbon he had quietly bought for her hair. Reverend Pike opened his Bible, his voice steady in the stillness. "Elias Boone, do you take this woman?" Elias's answer was firm, as solid as a hammer strike on wood. "I do." When Reverend turned to Ahyoka, she lowered her eyes for a moment, her cheeks flushed, but then she lifted her gaze, and her voice, accented and halting but strong, carried through the room. "I do." Elias's hand tightened around hers, his eyes holding hers with a look that seemed to carve the moment deep into both their hearts. A new beginning was sealed not by obligation, not by tribal law, but by their choice, when the vows were spoken. Reverend Pike smiled and recorded her name beside his in the parish book. A single line of ink, plain and small, yet heavy with meaning. Back at the cabin, Elias placed the finished cradle by the bed. Ahyoka laid her hand-sewn blanket inside, its tiny bead at the corner clicking softly when the wind stirred. They stood together, looking down at the work of their hands, the promise of their future. The cabin that had once held only silence and loss now carried vows, warmth, and joy. Elias squeezed her hand gently. She answered with a shy nod, her face glowing with quiet happiness. The joy wasn't loud, but steady like spring sunlight slipping through the cabin window. Warm and enduring. Elias Boone and Ahyoka Graybird, two lives once broken, had begun to write a new chapter, the chapter of family. Spring spread across Juniper Basin, melting snow into streams and soft earth, turning the harsh land into a place of renewal. The small log cabin, once echoing with silence and loss, had changed. It was no longer a retreat for one man hiding from grief. It had become a home for a family. Elias Boone, a man once crushed beneath sorrow, now found purpose in the rhythm of each day. Beside him, Ahyoka Graybird was no longer the frail Apache girl he carried in from the snow. She was his wife, the mother of the child growing inside her. They no longer looked at one another through the lens of sacred law, nor did they move under the shadow of old wounds. Between them lay something simple but unshakable love, freely chosen. Each morning sunlight fell across the floorboards, Elias rising to light the stove while Ahyoka prepared their meal. Together they shared the daily labors splitting wood, tending Thunder, planting beans and corn beside the cabin. With every task, the place gained new meaning. Where once only wind and hammer blows had filled the air, now came the small sounds of living soft laughter, evening whispers, and quiet hope spoken for the child soon to be born. One afternoon, Elias sat beside the juniper cradle he had built, running his hand along its smooth edge. Ahyoka came to him, resting her hand on his shoulder. "He'll sleep well here," she said softly. Elias turned, took her hand, and nodded. In that moment they both understood the cradle was more than wood. It was a promise, a symbol of a future they had chosen together, instead of letting the past define them. Trips into Sagebrush Crossing were still uneasy. There were stairs, muttered words, and moments when Ahyoka lowered her gaze, but she no longer faced them alone. Elias walked beside her, steady, his hand brushing hers, his presence a shield. His firm, unbending stance made the townsfolk think twice. Over time, they began to understand this was no cast-off woman. This was the wife of Elias Boone, a man who no longer bowed to the weight of his past. At night, in the glow of the stove, they shared stories. Elias spoke of boyhood back east, of a small dream of a home he thought forever lost. Ahyoka sang bits of her mother's songs, spoke of fire-lit nights in her tribe. In those exchanges, they pieced themselves together, building something whole from fragments. It was rebirth, not declared with speeches but lived in the quiet honesty of sharing. And to you listening now, perhaps you've known loss. Perhaps you've wondered if life had nothing left to give. Let Elias and Ahyoka's journey remind you even two souls broken by grief found their way back to love, to hope, to tomorrow. If this story touched your heart, please press like to show your support, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Because somewhere out there, your story of renewal may be the light another person needs. For Elias and Ahyoka, the question is no longer survival. It is what future will they build now. The cabin is a start, but a family requires more land to work, cattle to keep, and most of all, a community willing to see them not as outcasts, but as their own. Perhaps Elias's next step is to stand once again among neighbors, no longer hiding. Perhaps Ahyoka's is to reclaim her voice not just as wife and mother, but as a woman with a past, with value, with strength to stand where once she was cast aside. The child soon to be born will grow not only on bread and milk, but on the courage and devotion of its parents. And what do you think, what name should they give their child? A name echoing the hard land of the West, or one rooted in the songs of Ahyoka's people? Share your thoughts below. Your voice may help shape the next chapter of their story. When night falls on Juniper Basin, the cabin glows with lamplight. Elias sharpens his knife, no longer with emptiness in his eyes. Ahyoka stitches by the fire, her hand resting on her belly. The fire pops. Thunder shifts in the corral, and the world hums with ordinary sounds. Yet within that simplicity lies something greater, the power of choice, the courage of love, the hope of renewal. And that, friends, is the truth we carry away from this tale. No matter how deep the night, there can be a dawn. No matter how scarred the heart, it can beat again, whole and warm. Elias Boone and Ahyoka Graybird have shown us this, and perhaps, just perhaps, you too are standing at the edge of your own new beginning.